Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Vecenie. Today, Fred Katz from The Athletic is joining me, and we're going to talk about something very simple. Who are the most important players in the NBA this season to their team's success, either on the NBA title sphere or just making the playoffs or whatever? We're going to dive into all of that. But first, let's hit the music.
They do have a timeout. Decide not to use it. Way downtown.
Bang! Bang! What's this gonna be? Wow! Are you kidding me?
Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Vecenie. But if you watch the tape, what you will see completely orchestrated this game. Fred, what's going on, buddy?
How you doing? Look at you in your Mets hat. Your Mets hat? Why are you wearing a Mets hat?
Just I've picked up Mets fever. It's the reality here.
Paul Skeens is going to come over there and just slap the mustache off of your face.
The Mets have Starling Marte, and I would rather root for Starling Marte than Garrett Cole. Is kind of where I'm at this point in my life. Not to say Garrett Cole. I root for Garrett Cole. Like I root for all of the Pirates. See, like the Pirates are so bad that I don't feel angry when players leave because I just know that they're not going to pay them. So like I root for all of them to have success, like wherever. It's just Starling Marte, like he led Garrett Cole was a piece of this too, but like him and McCutchen in the outfield in like the early 2010s and like going into the mid 2010s kind of led that revival of the Pirates that happened for a minute there back in like 2013, 2014, 2015. So I gotta root for my guy here.
I can't believe that we're not entering Clay Holmes into the mix.
Oh no, we're not entering Clay Holmes into the mix. Clay Holmes was not good for the Pirates. Like there's a difference here. Yeah, I'm like, I think I texted you earlier this summer. Like we might have a reverse Clay Holmes happening with Dennis Santana, where Dennis Santana was like awful for the Yankees, and now he's like one of the Pirates' like most important relievers. So I'm hoping we get a reverse Clay Holmes here, but we'll see. Okay, so we're talking about the most important players in the NBA here. That's our goal today. I grabbed a list of 5. You brought in a list of 4. How did you go about this? And I want to be like kind of clear on how I did it first. Like I didn't think the reason this conversation came up, maybe we'll start here, is over the last month, I've been saying on the show that I think Tyrese Maxey is probably the most important player in the NBA this year because of his playing the point guard for a team that is integrating a ton of new pieces, has Paul George, has Joel Embiid, who is probably going to miss some time throughout the course of the year. It seems like the 76ers are being clear that they're just like going to allow him to not make his own schedule, but to make sure that they're going to focus on him being ready for the playoffs more than anything. It feels like is what they're flagging from press conferences and things like that. So when I look at Maxey, I look at him as somebody that really needs to be at an exceptionally high level, needs to get everybody involved, needs to make sure everybody's getting the ball in the right spots, and then also has to continue to take a leap forward and become, in my opinion, like this era's Damian Lillard, basically. So I've been saying that for the last month, and that's how this conversation kind of took place and how I came up with the idea for this show. When you made this, list of guys that you made for this show, this episode we're doing, what did you kind of consider in terms of the types of players that you wanted?
Some kind of mix of overall context of where they're at in their careers, how much whatever type of season they have has reverberations around not just their team, but the rest of the league. There is, one guy who I will name as my first guy who it's not just about how he performs and what happens with him and his team this year that is going to have an effect on just his team's prospects, which I think are better than people are giving them credit for. It's also going to have credit on, it's going to have an effect on the rest of the league. And quite honestly, some of them I'm just like, that's interesting. And I can talk about that with Sam on the podcast. And I was like, you know what? Like, I think Joel Embiid is probably more important than Tyrese Maxey. But Tyrese Maxey is more interesting to talk about as important on a podcast. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about some interesting stuff.
Yeah, and like if we're being completely honest here, right? Like the most important player in the league is Nikola Jokic. Second most important player in the league is Luka Doncic. The third most important player in the league is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, right? Like you can go down a list, and if I didn't say your favorite player, I don't mean to demean your favorite player. I'm just saying that the stars are more important, honestly, a lot of the time than some of the guys that we're going to talk about here. Insofar as if Luka Doncic gets hurt and misses the season, Dallas is cooked, right? But that's not an interesting conversation, kind of like you said at the end of the day. So I'll give you the floor here. Who is your first player that you want to talk about?
Well, I'm using my first player as a jumping off point to talk about him and two other players. And I kind of think, I don't know if he's number one on the list, but I think he's really interesting. And it's Bradley Beal.
Okay. I like this pick.
Because Phoenix was the most underwhelming team in the league last year. No question. They should have been really good. They weren't. They had a really interesting offseason. They had absolutely no resources because they're over the second apron. And I thought they did really well. They got Tyus Jones for the minimum, which is, one of the best value signings that you could possibly have. Certainly the best minimum signing of the summer. They bring in Monte Morris. Last year, they were a team that operated with no point guards. Now they have two point guards who haven't turned the ball over in decades, right? Like those two guys just never turn the ball over. And I do think we're going to get a bounce back year from Morris. Ultimately, though, what this team is built around is three stars. And I think for the most part, I'm taking injuries off the table because who knows? And again, that factors into the interesting thing. Who knows if they're going to be, if Durant's going to be healthy, if Booker's going to fall off, whatever else it is. Beal has had injury issues of himself, of his own. If those two play well together, and I'm talking about blow people off the court like they're supposed to, then that team has a chance to actually be really good and maybe finish in the West's top four, especially playing along a point guard. Last year, those three on the floor, the Suns were plus 7.5 together. That's a good to really good number. But the point of the Phoenix Suns is that number has got to be like double digits. And I know that sounds unfair. I know that sounds like an unfair expectation. But when you have those three together, then you need to be annihilating other teams to make up for all the times that you don't have those three together. I think the addition of Mike Budenholzer is going to clean things up. But ultimately, I do think that duo kind of comes down to Bradley Beal's importance, because as long as people are healthy, we know what we're getting from Devin Booker. We know you're getting a top 5 player in Kevin Durant, the guy who everybody looked to on Team USA to pull them out of ruts and whatever else. You know what you're getting in those guys. And Beal went there and had an efficient season that was lower usage than people thought and got really hot at the end of the year, but wasn't necessarily the binge scorer that people realized and didn't necessarily improve his defense all that much from the days in Washington. And if he can hit that level that he had previously, not necessarily in volume, but at least in terms of the threat of him to where he becomes so much more feared as opposed to being an 18-point guy, then all of a sudden you can't double team 6 guys. You can't double team 3 players with 6 guys because you don't have 6 guys. And I think he is really a turning point for them.
Well, and the other thing with them is that you can't double team a lot of guys anyway, just because if you double team, multiple guys on the court, you're probably leaving Grayson Allen open, who shoots 44% from 3. You might be leaving Yusuf Nurkic, but if Yusuf Nurkic is around the basket, sometime he'll smoke layups, right? That's the reality of the Yusuf Nurkic experience, but you probably don't want to give up an easy shot at the rim, right? The reason I didn't pick any Suns is because, we kind of said most important players this season. And I honestly think their most important thing here is Mike Budenholzer. Just even watching their preseason games, they're a team that I've actually watched a decent amount of now in preseason. I've watched probably a game and a half of their 2 preseason games that they've played. Their offensive movement, the ball movement, the way that the players are moving on offense off of the ball looks so much crisper than what it had been previously. They look like they're in so much more space now to attack. And that's the Mike Budenholzer experience. We know that Mike is this incredible offensive mind who does an amazing job of creating space. We saw it for years with Milwaukee. We saw it for years with Atlanta. That's why those Atlanta teams, which weren't the most talented teams in the Eastern Conference, ended up becoming a number 1 seed, number 2 seed type of team for a few years there. So that's why I didn't pick any of the players. But to your point on Beal, I actually think that he hits the criteria perfectly, because if he is not the Bradley Beal that was there in Washington, this is probably not a title contender, just point blank. They need a third guy. Kevin Durant and Devin Booker need a third guy to be there. And I trust those two implicitly to be there. As long as they're healthy, they're going to be great. They're going to be all NBA players. But Bradley Beal was not that last year. And we can talk a lot about the depth. We can talk about Royce O'Neal being there for a full season, Grayson being on this great contract now, whatever the Yusuf Nurkic, experience will be under a new head coach in Budenholzer, Tyus Jones being there on a minimum, etc. But if Bradley Beal isn't the guy that they traded for, given his contract, given everything attached to him, they're just like a non-contender this year. They're kind of like a non-contender into the future, because it's going to be really, really hard for them to make moves around this roster.
Yes, 100%. And that's part of the reason why, I mentioned how importance isn't just about, when you're talking about the really important guys, it's not just about reverberations on your own team. It's also about what happens in the rest of the league. Okay, well, let's say a world where Bradley Beal doesn't have his best season. Let's say he has a downswing. And let's say the Suns, maybe they win a playoff series. Winning a playoff game would be an improvement for them. They got swept last year. Maybe they win a playoff series. Maybe they don't. But it doesn't ever look great. They don't ever look like a contender. What happens with that team? Because Beal's got no trade clause. Yeah. And Kevin Durant is extension eligible and has not added a year onto his contract, which is something that I have been eyeing, because it's really important. Over the summer, Woj reported all that stuff about Houston readying to make moves for Durant down the line if and when he becomes available. And in that moment, Suns owner Matt Ishbia puts out a tweet, right? Like basically in the moment, being like, you're committed to Kevin Durant. If you're committed to Kevin Durant, you probably want to add, he can add 1 year onto his contract because of the over 38 rule. Probably want to add that extra year onto his contract. The fact that it hasn't happened yet is something that I'm just looking at it. I'm like, okay, it's interesting that he hasn't added that extra year, which can be max money, and he hasn't done it. I'm keeping my eye on that, and you wonder what will happen with the Suns, because their way of recouping things is by trading Durant or Booker or both, which you can obviously get a ton for because they're both fabulous, fabulous players. And you wonder what's going to happen. To your Budenholzer point, by the way, which is a really good one. And you mentioned the offense. I'm really interested to see what Bud does for them in like the grit type stuff as well. Because the thing with Phoenix is Nurkic in his prime was actually a pretty underrated rim protector, but now I don't think he necessarily has that element. And with Phoenix, what they're missing is basically a center who is going to give you any sort of imposing nature in the paint, because they're not getting that with Plumlee. And there were too many situations defensively last year where, even though they finished top half of the league in defense, where I just thought they looked out of sync. There's a play, you mentioned their preseason. They played Detroit at Michigan State a couple of days ago. And at the very beginning of the game, like 3 minutes into the game, there's a play where Cade Cunningham is going up against is running a pick and roll on the right wing, which is being guarded by Booker and Durant, two guys who have now played together for a year and a half. And Durant and Booker botch the switch. One of them thinks they're supposed to switch. The other one thinks they're not supposed to switch. Cunningham gets all the way to the rim, and he just absolutely yams on Mason Plumlee. And the highlight reel looked like he was dunking on Mason Plumlee. But the reality is, the Suns had a communication botch up there. And I recognize it was 3 minutes into a preseason game. Ultimately, that doesn't matter. And mistakes like that are made for the preseason. However, the Suns don't have that small little margin. They have, I should say, that small little margin of error for error now, where like Durant and Booker are a year and a half into being together. Those are the things that they have to iron out. I think Bud will help with that in the long term. He's very good on that. They were 20th in defensive rebounding last year. Bud teams don't finish 20th in defensive rebounding. They were like bottom 5 or 6 in turnover rate. Bud teams don't finish bottom 5 or 6 in turnover rate. Like that never happens. So I imagine those kind of things will be ironed out. And if that's the case, like I feel like we should be talking about the Suns as like a stealth. No one's talking about them as like stealth top 3 in the West. But
yeah, no,
I
think that ceiling
on the table
exists. Yeah, I think that ceiling really exists this year. No question. Just based off of like the stylistic offensive improvement I've seen in the preseason, I feel like Bud's stuff is getting through maybe a little bit more than like the Vogel-y stuff. We associate like high level defensive energy and honestly rebounding and rim protection with Frank Vogel. And I felt like we didn't get as much of that last year, but I think we're already seeing a little bit more of the Vogel-y or the Budenholzer-y stuff get through whenever I watch them. Okay. My first player is going to be Ja Morant. Ja Morant is just a very obvious pick to me because if this Grizzlies team does not have Ja Morant, they kind of don't have an offense. I mean, I don't know how much Grizzlies tape you watched after the halfway point of last season when it was clear that they were tanking, but it was ugly. Like they were actually pretty okay on defense. That's the crazy thing, because any game that Jaren played and, any game that, they had like multiple dudes out there that were playing super hard. Certainly Vince Williams deserves a huge assist here. Like they generally really worked on that end of the court, but on offense, they just had nobody that could create shots. And that was without Desmond Bane too. And they had a number of bodies out throughout the course of the year, right? Jaren Jackson was required to create so much more on offense in a way that hindered his efficiency, to be sure. Might help his development long term, but certainly hindered their ability to create efficient offense, to be sure. But man, when Ja is out there, it just completely changes the tenor of everything that they do. And he obviously had like a little minor injury scare in a preseason game earlier this week. It seems like everything's going to be okay there, but him staying healthy and staying on the court just completely changes every single thing about this organization from top to bottom. They really need somebody like Ja Morant to be that offensive engine. And I think that, like, because of everything that's happened with Ja Morant, we kind of forget a little bit how incredible of an offensive engine he can be at times. His vision is unbelievable as a passer. He is explosive. He lives in the paint. He is a real significant finisher at the basket. He consistently drives paint touches just through his sheer presence on the court. They need that. If he's not there, again, like they need to make some real like organizational decisions. It feels like to me, depending on like, okay, can we trust Ja Morant to be here? Because if we can't, then we might need to make like other roster decisions on how we can best build this roster.
The other thing that's so important, which Ja does, which I don't know if anyone in the league does this as well as him. Certainly nobody on Memphis's roster. If you're going to say like important to the offense, 100%, he's especially important to just getting them in transition, because even when even when we've seen Ja at his absolute best, has always been a chore, Memphis's half court offense, even when Ja is at his absolute best. And when Memphis's half court offense was really gelling, why was it gelling? It wasn't gelling because they were making shots. It was gelling because Steven Adams got every damn offensive rebound, and they would have this fantastic second chance offense. And that was what
Jonas when he was there too. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. For sure. And they would get these offensive rebounds. And right now, I think there's a lot of pressure on Zach Edey for that reason. Having Brandon Clark back will absolutely help with that. He's a really good offensive rebounder, and people forget about him as a guy they were missing last year too. But like Ja Morant is going to have to get them in transition. So even if they're in a place where their half court offense is, I think they were not last year doesn't count. Last year was a lost year, but 2 years ago, when they were really good, I think they were still like 22nd, 21st in half court offense, according to Cleaning the Glass. And if they're going to meander around there, or even just in the bottom 15, then what you need is for Ja Morant to just kill everyone in transition. And it's not just about making sure that you score on fast breaks. It's not just about 7 seconds or less. It's also about just rushing the ball down the court, outletting quick, rushing the ball down the court. And maybe because you move so damn fast, somebody matches up wrong. And then that's going to help your calf court offense because someone's got a mismatch or someone's going to mess up a switch or someone's going to mess up a coverage because they're in a spot that's uncomfortable. And that's where Ja can pick you apart because he is a fabulous passer. But if they're not going fast, and I think they're going to have to, and they're going to have the ability to, like if he's playing next to Marcus Smart and you got Clark out there and you got Jaren Jackson Jr. out there with them, like you're going to be able to play fast. And if they are able to do that, they have a chance to be, I mean, I think they're going to be really good either way, but like that's their chance to really, really, really kind of take that leap that we've thought was possible for a long time. The half court offense was always what was their biggest quandary, right?
It was absolutely. So to 2 points in that regard. So first, Ja Morant's played 6,208 minutes over the course of the last 4 seasons. Memphis's offense has a 117 offensive rating when he is out there. And that number came in part before the offensive explosion of last year, right? Actually, it came entirely basically outside of 9 games before the offensive explosion of last season for some teams. When Ja Morant has been off the court, they have a 110.5 offensive rating. It is literally 6 points per 100 possession over a 4-year sample of like 15,000 minutes that the Memphis Grizzlies have played. They desperately need Ja Morant to be out there in a substantial way. To your point on the half court.
By the way, Sam,
right? Yeah,
a lot of those on-offs came with like Tyus Jones backing him up when Tyus Jones was like the best backup point guard in the league. So it's not like there was some huge fall off there from Ja to whoever was backing him up. Like, man, there was a whole stretch where Ja got hurt a couple of years ago and they were 20-5 with Ja out. And part of the reason was because you plug Tyus Jones in there and it's just like offense operates, as good as it's going to be. And you're right. I think you look at those numbers a little differently, knowing even there was strong personnel there.
The second point that I wanted to make is that Zach Edey is really interesting and critical here because Edey is an unbelievable screener. He is going to be such an incredible screener to getting Ja Morant that space that he needs. He's not going to be as good as Steven Adams probably as a rookie, but like he's that level of, screening prospect or whatever we want to call it, right? He was, I thought, the best screener in college basketball last season. He got dudes like Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer like so loose all the time. So what, and like his ability to like flip screens, reverse screens, set like little ass out screens, and then just like roll into post ups or roll into lobs. Like he is awesome as a screener and getting his guys free. How the thing that is different with him compared to Steven Adams, not terribly dissimilar from Jonas, I think how he plays in transition is going to be the most interesting piece of their season. Because Ja's going to want to go. Ja's going to want to get up and down, want to get up the court, try and get easy buckets that way. Edey does not run the floor super well. Like he's in incredible shape for how big he is. He's 7'4", 300 pounds. And like you see him, he's honestly like pretty skinny. Bizarre. Like he does an amazing job of staying in condition. He would run out 40-minute games last year. But he doesn't have that like speed up and down that Ja Morant has. So what is the push-pull of those two things will be kind of interesting to me to track as well. Not even necessarily in like full transition sets, right? Where Ja's just, grabbing a rebound and going, and it's just like a shot within 3 seconds of the shot clock, right? It's more that distance between like 6 and 9 seconds of the shot clock having started, right? So the 18 to 15 second mark. Does he slow down their like slightly early offense kind of thing in that respect while he's getting up and down the court? That's where it'll be really, really interesting to me to track that kind of push pull between Ja and Zach Edey's pacing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's also going to be, how do you think he's going to fit with like, let's say they're starting 5 spacing? What do you make of like his game on the inside with not, I mean, look, Bane is one of the most underrated shooters in the league. He's freaking awesome. But they don't have ideal spacing around the court. What do you make of kind of his fit inside of there?
It'll be interesting to watch. I think that teams will probably sag off of Smart. I think teams, I don't know how they'll treat Ja is kind of my thing, because like teams generally try and prove to Ja that he's going to have a game that will shoot. So I'm a little bit skeptical of the spacing, if I'm being completely transparent. But
and teams will help off it. Teams will help off of Jackson. They'll help off a Ja.
Yeah. Like they need Jaren to have a good shooting year. Like that is an undeniable fact to me. Like Jaren last year shot 32% from 3. He needs to get back to his first 2 years where he was like 36, 39%. If you look at his last 4 years, Jaren has not really made threes at the level that, he gets the credit for being necessarily. He's at like 32.6% over those last 4 years. So that's almost the biggest swing to me within their half court offense is Jaren has to shoot. Like there's no question here about how they have to get to that next level. It has to be Jaren shooting from distance in part. There are other things, but that's a non-negotiable to me.
Especially because like defensively, he's just not best as a 5. It's not like he's bad as a 5. He's one of the best defenders in the league, but the foul rate goes way up when he's a 5. He doesn't anchor the defense the same way. We saw him struggle even when he was with Team USA having to play the 5. He's much stronger as a 4 defensively and much better optimized as a 4 defensively. And if you're going to have him next to a 5, like you mentioned him shooting 36, which would probably be a career high. I don't even know if that's enough. Because to be honest, the goal for Jaren Jackson should not be shoot a high enough percentage to where you're making, X percent. It should be shoot a high enough percentage to where you force guys to actually close out on you, and you can maybe empty out those tight spaces that seem kind of somewhat, predetermined in the middle of the floor. And if Jaren Jackson's shooting 36% halfway into the year, I think the sample size on him is large enough now to where teams are like, we can help
let
off
this
him.
go.
Yeah, we'll still let this go. The example that I use is, I covered Julius Randle's season a couple of years ago. He was taking 41 threes a game.
From 3.
Yeah. I wasn't even going to say, I was actually thinking 2 years after that, took 8 threes a game and shot 35% or whatever, made it into the 3-point contest, and had just shot 41 2 years earlier. And he was taking 8 a game. Like if you weren't near him, he was going to put it up. And don't get me wrong, teams closed out on him with a little more urgency than they did in, say, the previous season when he shot 30%.
But the difference between Jaren and Julius, though, is that I think part of the reason that you close out on Julius is because Julius is like a bowling ball and is physical. And if you don't get early contact on him on his drives, he's going to go through you, like no questions asked, right? So you almost have to stay a little bit tighter to him. Jaren doesn't really do that yet. Mm-hmm. Like he doesn't go through dudes like Julius could just like power up through dudes, right? So that piece of it is also really, really important. Jaren, shot. The reason that Jaren has this reputation is because he shot 36% from 3 as a rookie and then 39% on 6.5% attempts per game as a sophomore. So over the course of his first 2 years, he was at 4.4 attempts per game, hitting 38% from 3. And the second year, he was at 6.5 attempts per game, right? That's why people thought he was a shooter and why he got treated as a shooter, I thought, in his second year and in his third year. But I think teams have kind of stopped doing that more realistically now. Okay. You had Ja on your list as well. Who is your third player that you had?
Okay. I got a little creative here, Sam.
I love it.
Maybe you don't. Maybe I'm ruining the premise. I happen to know your producer quite well. And
yes, you do. Shout out the Mets, baby.
And he hates it when I completely ruin the premises of his podcasts. So I decided I was just going to ruin the premise of the podcast, and I'm going to pick a player who's not in the NBA as my next one. as the guy who I had as my second most important player, and it's Cooper Flagg.
Sure. So I think this is an interesting take, especially for this show.
How many different teams is he? Yeah, honestly, I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on Cooper Flagg, and how many different teams do you think are going to feel the effects of the fact that, I mean, look, you have said a million times, like, it's not just Cooper Flagg. The whole top 5 next year is really good, and really a lot of people around the league would be really excited if they just got like number 3, and you could end up with a really awesome player.
Yeah. Look, it's a really good top 5. I will say that, like, I think some people are like overstating it a little bit. I think the 2023 top 3 coming into the year was better than this top group. Like, you had Victor, who was like this unbelievable, like, all-time prospect. You had Scoot, who we all thought was, a generational point guard prospect. And then you had Amen Thompson, who we all thought was like a generational athlete, basically. With Cooper is really good. Cooper is not quite at the level, to me, of Victor, right? Cooper is a great prospect. He is certainly one of the 10 best prospects, coming into a year. We'll see how that develops throughout the course of the year. Probably in the top 10 prospects that I've gotten a chance to see coming into a year, like in high school, for sure. But there are enough worries about Cooper, and Cooper is 17 years old. He is so young. He's at an earlier stage of his development than, like, think about Brandon Miller. Brandon Miller was 21 as a, first year NBA player last year. Cooper Flagg is still 17 years old. He is so young and early in his growth, right? But because of that, and I'm like kind of shitting on your question now, or on your guy a little bit, and I don't mean to do that.
Do it. No, do it. Do it.
We'll get to the positive stuff. I will say that his ability to create shots for himself is still developing. I'm not sitting here and telling you that it's not real and that it won't be real moving forward. He's still so young, and he's shown significant, substantial growth in that capacity over the course of the last year and a half, I would say, really the last 18 months as a shot creator. But he's not like Paulo was a lot more developed as a shot creator going into Duke. Chet Holmgren is 7'1" in a lot of ways. The interesting thing about Cooper is, like, you have a chance, if his development goes right over the next couple of years, to combine a lot of the exciting aspects of Chet Holmgren, the anticipation, the preternatural anticipation on defense, the hand-eye coordination that makes him one of the best defensive playmakers I've ever evaluated in my life. In addition to some of the things, not all of the things, that Paulo brings as a creative offensive force who can create shots and who can do some things. But he's a lot closer to the Chet side than he is the Paulo side. And I love Chet. It's funny. So Austin Rivers yesterday tweeted this video saying that he was having a conversation with one of his friends saying, would you take Chet Holmgren right now for a guaranteed number 1 overall pick where you could take Cooper Flagg, if like that hypothetical existed in the world? And it was really funny because I literally had that conversation with an NBA executive like 2 days ago. And ultimately, like, we went back and forth on it a little bit. We weren't real sure what the answer was. Like, we decided, like, either way we think is probably an okay answer. But I said Chet still. Like, given what we've seen from Chet in the NBA so far, given his shooting, given that he's 7'1", I think I would go Chet still, while also acknowledging that Cooper has, so much more room for growth and is, I think, almost 4 years younger than Chet, right? Maybe 4 full years younger than Chet. So it to me, like, the level that Cooper gets to as a player this year at Duke is almost more important than, like, who he is, or the teams that are tanking, right? Because teams do still have some questions on Cooper and certainly on Ace. I mean, Ace, still like nothing is easy for Ace on the court. Ace Bailey at Rutgers. Everything is a pull-up jumper in a way that is concerning. Dylan Harper like just doesn't have a lot of explosiveness and pop, but he has like unbelievable polish, unbelievable footwork, shot creation ability. VJ Edgecombe is this player that is explosive as you will find vertically, but he's good first step, not like an amazing first step, but a good first step, and like doesn't really have a left hand to be able to create off the bounce and like consistently play as like a lead guard at a guy that I think is going to come in around like 6'3" to 6'3.5" in terms of his measurement. So that's a lot to throw at you in terms of your premise to this question. How does that make you feel about the Cooper Flagg experience? And I don't want to diminish your point here because undeniably teams are setting themselves up to tank this year. The Brooklyn Nets are setting themselves up unequivocally. How quickly teams pull the ripcord is going to be fascinating as well. So I'll let you take it from there.
It's like you read my mind because it was the perfect transition. Because I mean, look, I'm not a prospect guy the way that you are. I grew up a bigger college fan than I did NBA fan, and then completely deviated on that when I started covering the NBA. And so I can't speak to Cooper Flagg in the way that you can. The reason that I have him on this list, because if we're talking about the most important player this year, the effects that he's going to have on the league this year are tremendous. And it's not just about teams like the Nets who are going to be going after him. Teams at the bottom of the standings, like Toronto, is going to go after him, and Portland is going to go after him, and Utah is going to go after him. It's also going to be, you called it the ripcord. That's a very good way to put it. For example, Utah is a really good example of this franchise. The last 2 years, Utah has kind of had the same season where they play hard, they're well coached, and they defy expectations for like 40 to 50 games. Then it gets to the trade deadline, and they're like, we're trading Olynyk, we're trading Fontecchio, we got to play the young guys, random guys are going to be out, we got to tank down, and it's too late for them to tank for a number 1 pick realistically. They end up somewhere, in the middle of the lottery by the end of it, and that's it. I wonder if a team either that is Utah or is in the position that Utah was in previously, if they even let it get to 40 or 50 games this year. Because Utah, for example, is a team that like they can't do that again. Like they can do that again. They have so many picks from other teams. They can do that again. And they just extended Lauri Markkanen, but they have too much talent to be that bad. I wonder with the Nets, you mentioned them as like a team that's obviously going to dive. Right now, the Nets, as currently constructed, if they optimized their roster, even if Ben Simmons never played, if they optimized their roster, they're not the worst team in the NBA. They have real NBA players on that roster. Cam Johnson's a real NBA player. Dorian Finney-Smith's a real NBA player. Those guys are going to get traded at some point, and they're going to be repurposed to winning situations where Dorian Finney-Smith can just like plop in and hit some threes for you and guard some good wings and maybe help a team as a rotation player to a title or to win a conference or whatever, where Cam Johnson can play a similar sort of role as a younger player on a pretty team-friendly contract too. They're going to have to find ways to rid themselves of those guys in an environment, by the way, that is very difficult for good teams / expensive teams to make trades. And so that I'm really curious to see exactly how that's going to go about. I'm really curious to see what happens with the Spurs, who like the Spurs want to compete now.
The Spurs were like the team as you were talking. I was going, man, like if they start poorly, if they go like 10-20 in their first 30 games or something, like, do they just decide, okay, let's go try and get our next guy to pair with Victor?
Totally. I mean, I actually wrote that. I wrote a column on the Spurs earlier this week, and basically about like, there is a chance that Victor Wembanyama shows up this season, and he's just one of the very few players already in the league who, if you have him on your team, you're just not going to win fewer than 35 games. And there's a chance they get off to a decent start. They have, for the Western Conference, they have a pretty friendly schedule to start the year. And if a third way through the year, they're 13-14 or they're 14-13 or something like that, their offseason moves were to win. Their stated objective is to win. They want to be competitive this year. They're over losing 60 games, they say.
I'm still skeptical how much their offseason moves were to win, as opposed to just be like developmentally competent. But I understand your point.
I think it was both. I think it was a two-purpose, especially Chris Paul was like a two-purpose sort of thing, especially after they saw like Wembanyama. And you know what? Let's just can we go to my next player?
Yeah. We can go to your next.
Because my next player is Victor Wembanyama.
Okay. Yeah. Let's just talk about it. Let's get this.
And I think they looked at what happened last year. Wembanyama and Trey Jones are on the court together, and the Spurs are like, what was it, +7 per 100 possessions? +5.
They were awesome when.
They were +5 when Wembanyama and Jones were on the court together, and when it was Wembanyama, Vassell, and Jones, they were +10 for 100 possessions. And I don't think they look at that and they're like, oh, that's the core. Wembanyama, Vassell, and Trey Jones, that's the core. But I do think they look at that and say, all right, well, Wembanyama played the 4 for the first 25 games of last year, and he's way better utilized as a 5, which they put him at midway through the year. And this is what happens when you have Wembanyama, along with just a competent point guard who doesn't turn it over, because none of the Joneses turn it over, neither Tyus nor Trey. And Chris Paul doesn't turn it over and knows how to run an offense. And if they get off to a nice start, like their stated goal, they want to compete. They don't want to try to win 60. However, if they're like 8-19 at the start, I could see them being like, screw this. Let's go pair Victor Wembanyama with somebody fantastic and trying to get down. I don't know how you do that while still playing Wembanyama if he's as good as he potentially could be this year. If he really makes a serious leap, it might just be like when you have Giannis on your team. It's like, you can't do it. Or he might be a year away from that and he's not too good to tank with. And all of a sudden you give yourself a top 5 chance at the first pick and you land it. And now you have, the 2 of the best number 1 picks that we've had in recent years, in your organization, which would be fantastic for them. So I'm curious to see what happens with them. I mean, there are other organizations where it's like, look, there are 13 teams that are not like outwardly not trying to tank right now in the Western Conference.
Yes.
Some of them will be bad. Some of them will be bad. Like, we don't know what's happening with Kawhi Leonard. And that's really interesting for another reason, because the Thunder can take their pick and it's unprotected. And so if that pick ends up being number 1, it's going to be like the Baron Davis trade all over when Kyrie went number 1 and the Clippers included the number 1 pick to acquire Mo Williams when they sent out Baron Davis. And it ends up being a Kyrie number 1 overall pick. I think that had the 8th best odds at number 1. They didn't protect it. And it's going to be another situation like that if that ends up going to number 1. So there are a lot of interesting storylines to follow this year in terms of how teams play this. And I think the fact that this is not whether Cooper Flagg ends up being awesome or not, it's less about what he is and more about how the pull that he is having on the league, how teams are acting because of what they believe he could be. And you see a lot of teams that I think are going to act differently than they did, say, last year when we didn't know who the number 1 pick was going to be at this time.
Nobody cared last year. Like, they wanted like a top 5 pick by the end of the year, but like nobody was out here trying to like outwardly tank for, until maybe game 50 or 60. Right. That was when we saw some teams pull the ripcord last year. This year, I think it could happen drastically earlier, to your point. On the Wembanyama side, because I agree with you, like Victor, I didn't have Victor on my list, but like Victor is undeniably like an incredibly interesting player this year. What my worry with the Spurs is I kind of said a little bit earlier, I worry that the guys that they got are less than what people think that they are, maybe. Like, I'm not sure if people recognize the level to which it felt like Chris Paul slowed down last year. And look, I think Chris Paul is still like a competent starting point guard in the NBA. I don't want to sit here and say like, oh yeah, he came off the bench at Golden State. Like, he's not, he's a bench player now. I don't think he's that. Like, I think he is like a competent starting point guard, and they needed 48 minutes of competence at the point guard position, which is really what Chris Paul brings them. And I think that is a big lift for them. But I don't think Chris Paul's going to come in and be like a top 15 point guard, which is what it feels like some Spurs fans are kind of expecting. Think that they just think, oh yeah, he was like traded to the Warriors and it was a funky situation. Like he's going to go right back to being like the metrics god that he was previously. And I'm not convinced that's going to be the case. Harrison Barnes like could not defend last year. Point blank, like he could not move last year. He can shoot, like that's a value add for them. They need a 4 who can knock down shots. But he is not a defensive player. And look, they have the ultimate defensive cheat code right now in Victor. And that is a huge, huge factor for them. Where when you have Victor Wembanyama at the center position and you have Sohan next to him and you have Trey Jones at the point of attack and you have, any number of other like potential defensive options that they have, you probably are going to end up right around like a top 10 defense, I would guess. They could end up, higher than that, but let's say like their ballpark is a league average defense is a baseline just because of Victor, if not slightly better than that. So defensively, they're going to be good. I just worry about what the offense is going to look like if Devin Vassell doesn't take that next step forward as a shot creator. Frankly, like if Victor does not become more efficient as a shot creator, I think he probably will at the end of the day, but like, and this is preseason and I don't like taking any takeaways in terms of actual quality of play from preseason. I like taking stylistic things, as I talked about with Phoenix earlier. I still felt like Victor was just like kind of taking some shots where I was like, okay, like you're kind of just out there on the perimeter. You're not doing what the idea of Chris Paul to me is like, okay, we have a point guard who's going to feed him easier shots at the rim, right? That's the real hope here, is that Victor's efficiency will increase by nature of getting a better shot distribution at the basket. But if he still has to create everything, that's still going to be hard for him. And I don't know if he's quite there yet as being like the primary shot creator on an NBA team from day one of this season, right? Every season, Victor has gotten better and better and better. So he'll probably get better throughout this season too. But I just worry that, yeah, like they don't have a ton of bodies beyond like their first 7 guys. They don't have, it's just asking a lot of Chris Paul and, Harrison Barnes as a floor spacer and Jeremy Sohan to take a leap on offense. And you're trying to hit a parlay, basically. You're trying to hit a 6-tiered parlay with the Spurs is what it feels like to me, where Victor takes the big leap as a shot creator. Keldon Johnson, takes a nice size leap. Devin Vassell takes a leap into being like a true number 2 option. Chris Paul is there and plays 65 games. Harrison Barnes knocks down 39% of his threes. Some of these are more likely than others. Jeremy Sohan takes a big leap on offense, right? Some of these things are more likely than others. But that's what happens when you bet a parlay, right? Some of them are minus 150, some of them are minus 450, and you still rarely hit them at the end of the day. So that's what the Spurs feel like to me. They feel like a 16 parlay that you're trying to hit in terms of them making the playoffs, but it's possible they could, but I wouldn't say it's like overly likely at this stage.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I'm not picking them to make the playoffs. I'm not picking them to make the playoffs. I think they could be in tension for the play-in. I think they could. I think the argument for that would be not necessarily even just what you're talking about. I think the other part of it is sometimes you can get better, not even by necessarily making these fantastic additions or these spectacular changes, but just by trimming the pork. So last year, I mentioned Wembanyama playing the 4 for a lot of the year. That made him worse. Jeremy Sohan was playing point guard for a lot of the year. That was an experiment.
It was catastrophic. Yeah. And
right.
I like
Sohan a lot. That
was insane.
And you know what? I remain convinced, because I think Jeremy Sohan's going to be a good role player. And I remain convinced that we're going to look back on Jeremy Sohan's time playing the point and say, that was good for him. The same way how like Bruce Brown came up a point guard, and nobody thinks of Bruce Brown as a point guard now, but Don't you think that Bruce Brown's time as a point guard helped him see the floor and learn as a facilitator when it comes to setting screens, secondary facilitating, no other guys' roles, all that kind of stuff? Boris Diaw came up a point guard, same thing.
Sohan has a chance to be like a supersized Bruce Brown, and that's like an awesome player, by the way.
Right. If Bruce Brown were 6'8", Bruce Brown's already really good.
Has even more defensive versatility. Like that's an amazing player. And it's interesting to me that you bring up Wemby, because two of the guys on my list, and I can kind of combine them to kind of shoot through this a little bit, are also the guys that like he will probably be compared with throughout the course of his career. The one is obvious. It's Chet Holmgren. The other one is Evan Mobley. And the reason I picked those guys is because whereas Victor is sliding to the 5 full time this year, and it's because Victor is, 7'4" and should always be playing the 5. And in my opinion, certainly at least Chet should always be playing the 5, but they have a different roster construction this year. Those guys are 7-footers that are now playing the 4 because they're multi-skilled and multi-talented. And in Chet's case, it's going to be how he adjusts to playing the 4 full time, right? There were moments where they play him with Jalen Williams last year. There were some moments here and there where he would slide down the lineup a little bit, especially against bench units. But this year with Hartenstein there, if you watch their preseason games, I mean, they're like incredibly fucking fun to watch right now, because even in the preseason stylistically, because they're doing so much fun shit with Hartenstein on dribble handoffs, letting him like initiate some half court stuff, playing him at the top of the key and like just letting him be that like hub a lot of the time. But also, the way Chet shoots it felt like last year he really wanted to get more arc on the shot. It felt like he really wanted to quicken the release a little bit as well. Those are key things if he's going to be playing the 4, because he needs to be a volume shooter at that point. And they're still going to play him a decent amount of minutes at the 5. Like I can't imagine that their rotation is going to be, so rigid, because Dagnall is an incredible coach, to where Chet's playing the full-time 4. He definitely won't be doing that. But how those two kind of play together is going to be a critical piece within the title picture of the NBA this season. And they have the flexibility in the playoffs to be able to go in any number of different ways now. It's why they're my title pick. They have the ability to play as big as you need to or as small as you need to with Chet, J-Dub, Shea, Caruso, Lou Dort, et cetera, on offense and on defense. In Mobley's case, it's that we need to see the skill development. It's almost like Mobley and Chet are like the antithesis of one another to me. Chet is like this incredibly skilled 7-footer who has like this where they overlap is like they both have unbelievable defensive anticipation and they make incredible weak side rotations and they, cover so many different gaps, right? And they're both like all defense caliber players, but they almost even defend differently, right? Like Evan is this unbelievable like scramble defender. Chet is this incredible drop defender. I think Evan is like an okay drop defender. He's more of an incredible weak side defender who scrambles around and switches and does all sorts of things. Then on offense, Chet is not overly fast, but he's incredibly skilled. Mobley has like real speed and fluidity and flexibility, but the skill level hasn't come yet, right? And for the Cavs to take the next leap, they literally just fired JB Bickerstaff and brought in Kenny Atkinson. The more important thing for them is Evan Mobley being able to be that next guy, right? Being able to be that real hub at the 4, that creator that they need next to Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland.
Yes, that's very true. And look, the Cavs are such an interesting team in general, because you look at the vibes that are coming out of there and you observe the vibes, and it's like they won in the first round last year, but it was a really weird series against Orlando where kind of neither team played great. They were not playing their best 4 players together in any important moments last year. They just weren't. They had gotten to the point where in the fourth quarter, they didn't want to play Mobley and Allen together. They didn't think those guys should be on the court together at their most important moments. Then you look at Donovan Mitchell's season. When did Donovan Mitchell play the best? When Garland was out. And you look at Garland's season. When did Garland play the best? When Donovan Mitchell was out. I think those 4 were only played in 28 different games together. And yet you look at Cleveland and like all that stuff is like Mobley and Allen on the court together. Cleveland's basically net even. When the whole point of what you're supposed to be doing with those two is have this tremendous rim protection combination who are both good passers and skilled with ball skills on offense and can do stuff. And it just never quite looked right. And yet you look at Cleveland, you're like 2 years ago, they had the second best net rating in the entire league.
Yes.
Second in the league. And they got waxed by the Knicks in the first round of the playoffs. It was as much of a demolition as a 5-game series is going to be. It was a 5-game series that really felt truly a gentleman's sweep, the definition of a gentleman's sweep in that one. And you look at their moves and it's like, okay, Max Strus had a pretty good year and he makes sense. And he was actually solid for them defensively, and his shooting, his extra playmaking gives them a little bit of extra juice. And you look at their roster and you're like, okay, there is something there if those guys just play together and figure something out to where they can at least switch back to where they were a couple of years ago. They extended Allen. They extended Mobley. They extended Mitchell. They have Garland. Like, they're keeping this roster together. And I'm really curious to see if Kenny Atkinson goes out and tries to, what he ends up doing. I haven't watched them yet in the preseason, but I'm really curious to see how Kenny Atkinson goes about trying to use those guys differently offensively, especially the two bigs. Because, like, look, Mobley is tremendously talented, and Allen is an all-star center. He's one of the best rim diving centers in the league, and he's a really good defensive center as well.
Yep.
And the best version of the Cavs isn't choosing one or the other to play in the important moments, where, like, those two basically didn't even play fourth quarters together in the playoffs. The best version of the Cavs is finding some way to play those two together. And I am really curious to see how that goes this year. So that's a good call. That's interesting.
I just found, this incredibly fascinating as I was Googling these numbers. So over the last 2 years, Donovan Mitchell, Jared Allen, Darius Garland, Evan Mobley have played 1,200 minutes together. They have a plus 6.9 net rating altogether. When Donovan Mitchell is out there with Jared Allen, without Darius Garland and Evan Mobley, they have a plus 10.6 net rating in 1,100 minutes. When Darius Garland is out there with Evan Mobley, so you remove those two, Donovan Mitchell and Jared Allen, in 740 minutes, they have a plus 12 net rating. So it just kind of speaks to how disjointed this is felt throughout these 2 years where Donovan is there. And they're so talented that it almost doesn't matter, right? They're so good that they make it work together and they figure it out. But there has been a disjointed piece to this. In the way that you kind of combine that joint together is through Evan becoming a real creator to me, becoming that guy who can knock down shots from the perimeter, who can grab and go on the break and create easy, kind of transition opportunities for his team, who can slash and create off the wing whenever a defender closes out on him because the shooting is drastically better now, right? That's their next step, and Evan has to take it. With Chet, it's more just like, I think this is going to work. And I think this Oklahoma City team is just going to be like totally fine because the skill level is there and they're going to mix and match lineups in so many fun, different ways. But it's different than what they've done previously. They've gone full 5 out before, and Hartenstein is a different version of 5 out. He's, able to play make from the top of the key, and you're able to have that open space at the basket when Hartenstein is out there. But it's a different version of it, and they still have to figure out how to make that integrated and how to make that work. I mean, you watched Hartenstein for multiple years in New York, obviously, and you understand how that can work, but it's different than what Oklahoma City has done.
Yeah, I'm honestly just completely unconcerned about that, to be honest. Like I
get that.
I feel like, on top of the fact that Hartenstein is a very amenable and plug and play kind of guy, and Alex Caruso is a very amenable and plug and play kind of guy, I think Oklahoma City's identity, like their greatest identity over the last 2 years as they've gotten better, is that they have a flexible identity. They are shapeshifters. Mark Daigneault is the ultimate shapeshifter in every way. At any given point, you could ask Mark Daigneault, what's your rotation? It's like, could be anyone. There'll be a point guard who hasn't played in 7 games, and they'll just dust him off and throw him right in. And you'll just have a guy who you've never heard of playing in the rotation for 5 games, and then he'll be out. And it's part of his ploy of keeping guys ready, and mixing guys into a rotation and also gaining a sample size on how they may play and how certain lineups may play, seeing who has chemistry with whom, and so on and so forth. They play this very, very free-flowing style and this very versatile style, and they only got more versatile. Their biggest problem last year, rim protection, rebounding. Giddey struggled in the playoffs. They solved all of them and just brought in perfect fits for it. They're even arguably the best equipped team in the league to guard Nikola Jokic. I know Adam Morris has made this point about like the best way to guard Jokic is you kind of have one big on him, and then you have your fantastic shot blocker and rim protector kind of just digging at him off the ball. And that's part of what made Minnesota so
and
good.
then
but
the other stuff that bothers him, by the way, this is all in the margins with Jokic.
Wings digging in from the
long-armed wings like Shea and Jalen Williams and Alex Caruso and Lou Dort digging in and bothering him.
Totally. And not even just those guys, man. Like Aaron Wiggins can guard. Like
great point.
They are just loaded with guys who fit that bill. Who it used to be that the Thunder archetype was really athletic and really switchable and
it's fun to remember that you covered this. You covered that era of Thunder basketball.
Mm-hmm. That I did. Really athletic, really switchable, and can't shoot yet, but we're going to teach him to shoot. And that was
your guy, Josh Eustace, like the primary example.
Yep. I mean, a million of them, Thabo Cephalosha, and some of them did. Jeremy Grant learned how to shoot. And that became a fabulous trade, getting Jeremy Grant for Ersan Ilyasova. That was a really good trade. Jeremy Grant has turned into a wonderful player. And he learned how to shoot and do a lot more. And I think their archetype now is guys who can make really, really quick decisions. And that's what they go after. It's guys who can make really quick decisions and play in a number of different ways. They're a very versatile organization. They've gone after versatile players.
I've talked about this a lot. The Thunder draft, how I draft generally, like how I think of the draft, it's positional size, skill, processing. Those three things. And processing is number one to me, but positional size, processing, skill. Those are the three things I want on the court. And they do a great job of it. They do it allows you to stay flexible in so many ways. All right. Do you have time for this last guy on my list?
If we rush through it,
let's rush through it. It's Khris Middleton. This is actually kind of a simple conversation to me. The Bucks can't win the title unless Khris Middleton is who he is, right? It's actually very similar. We're kind of bookending this show with the Bradley Beal conversation and the Khris Middleton conversation with this really funny thing.
Sam, in the same week that Bradley Beal goes on Theo Pinson's podcast and is like, we were almost traded for each other.
That's exactly right.
Khris Middleton and Bradley Beal. Perfect.
We're bookending it with this. And they're in the same exact boat. Playing on a team with two absolute superstars. Giannis and Lillard in Milwaukee. Kevin Durant and Devin Booker in Phoenix, right? And they are the question mark based off of injury history. Bradley Beal missing time, throughout the course of his career. Khris Middleton this summer having had multiple ankle surgeries to have tried to fix his ankle and figure out how to make that work. If Khris Middleton isn't who they think Khris Middleton is, they don't have a secondary playmaker out on the perimeter with Dame. And that is curtains on their season. It seems like Middleton's going to be able to play in the preseason. That's what Doc is saying, that they have hopes that he'll be able to get some time here in the preseason. But I feel like early in the year, these first 30 games or so, we're going to see what Middleton is. And it's going to be essential for them to figure that out and figure out the lay of the land of their roster, because I have a number of questions about the Bucks in general, between Doc, between the Dame Giannis fit, but like all of it. Brook Lopez is a free agent this summer. If Middleton isn't the guy that they, signed to a deal last offseason, and Brook Lopez is a free agent this summer, they might have to completely almost tear down in a real way what their roster is around Giannis. And Giannis committed, so it's fine. I'm not saying that they're going to move Giannis, but if both of those guys, if Middleton isn't what he is, and then Brook leaves, it completely changes their entire situation as an organization.
Yes, it does. And look, one thing we should add is Middleton was really good during that playoff series against Indiana last year.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so there might still be something there. The concern with me, honestly, is just that he's so not what he was defensively. He was never an all defense level guy, but I'm still concerned about the perimeter defense. It got better during the offseason. DeLon Wright was a really good sneaky pickup. I know everyone talked about the Gary Trent Jr. one, and obviously that was, I mentioned Tyus Jones is the best minimum signing. If you don't agree with me, it's probably because you think Gary Trent is the best minimum signing, which is, and you'd have a good argument. I think those are probably the two guys. DeLon Wright, I think it's going to sneakily be like really important for them. I see a world where DeLon Wright is like the Bucks Twitter on-off darling that they pick up on, where it's like, when DeLon Wright is in the game, the Bucks are 8 points per 100 possessions better for whatever reason, because they just don't have anyone on the perimeter like him. He's really feisty. Taurean Prince, kind of a similar sort of thing where it's like, you only have these resources of getting a minimum, and he's not what you need in that role, but he's probably around the best that you're going to get for the resources that you had. I'm still worried about their perimeter defense because they're just kind of lacking the size to be able to guard big wings. Ideally, you want Giannis off the ball, not on it. And you want Lopez defending the rim as well. And you just have those two fantastic rim protectors. It's basically what the Cavs are hoping to do with Allen and Mobley, and they've never quite utilized it to the same degree that Milwaukee has when Milwaukee's been at its best. The other thing that I'll add is Khris Middleton can have as great of a year as we want. He can have a comeback year and look awesome and look like all of the ankle surgeries canceled each other out, and so added up to 0, and he looks healthier and better than ever. And if Dame plays like he did last year, it doesn't really matter. In terms
still
of
might not have enough juice.
They still might not have enough because, the excitement for them comes from the fact that you have Jan and Dame working in 2-man actions together, and just what a nightmare that is to guard. And in some ways, their time together last year was a little bit overstated because it's not like the Bucks offense stunk. It was really dynamic. It was really good. That was not their problem. Problem was transition defense, perimeter defense, all this other stuff. But it was also that like Dame did not play at an all-star level last year. I know he made it, but that was since he became like all caps Dame. That was the worst that he's played. And I know he was dealing with personal stuff for a lot of the year. And once you cover the league for long enough, you know that sometimes when a guy has a bad game or bad week, bad month, bad year, it's literally only the personal stuff. Like, sometimes that's just what happened. But he's also at the age right now where you kind of wonder, like, okay, I need to see it. I need to see it first before I'm fully on board with it only being the personal stuff that he was going through, because he did look a step slower and he did look like he struggled a little bit to create his own shot in a way that wasn't terrible or anything, but it wasn't elite prime Dame. And it did take him a little while for him and Giannis to develop. Yeah, I don't think they even really got to the level that we hoped. Yeah. They started running. They literally, like, the quantity of like their pick and rolls run went up once Doc got there and stuff. But like, I never thought like that was, they had the best chemistry. Like, I wouldn't take them over Murray and Jokic or something. I mean, those guys are like, they could play in their sleep. They could, the Draymond and Steph and Clay, like those guys know exactly where they are at all times. They could blindfold them and they're going to run exactly the same. Giannis and Dame weren't even close to something like that, and maybe familiarity gets them. How do you react to the fact that they said they didn't really play together at all this summer?
Don't know that I care. Like, I would like to see it happen, but like they're going to play 82 games this year and they're going to make the playoffs. So like that, to me, like getting live game reps is more important than getting the like summer stuff. It'd be great to get the summer stuff. Like, I'm all for it, but you're just not facing NBA caliber defense in the summer because guys aren't going that hard in the summer, right? They're trying to avoid wear and tear on their bodies. So like that stuff, yes, I would like to see it, but I'm not going to
except for Tibbs. Except for Tibbs and Russell Westbrook. Those are the two.
to your point on Middleton, I do just want to note, because I feel like I went super negative on Middleton, and I don't really mean to, because I think he's still an incredibly gifted, talented player who is now 33 years old, but still incredibly good. He averaged 25 points, 9 rebounds, and 4.7 assists with a 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio against Indiana in the playoffs. Shot 48, 36, 90 from the field. That is not just a good playoff series. That is an outstanding playoff series from Khris Middleton. He was nowhere near the issue for the Bucks. He needs to be that guy in the playoffs for them again. And again, like coming off multiple ankle surgeries, coming off of, you just never know what this is going to be, kind of. You never know when the cliff hits for some of these guys. And I hope it doesn't hit for Middleton. Middleton's been one of my guys that I've loved watching. It's been one of the most underappreciated players in the league for quite literally, I guess close to a decade now. I mean, I would say he took his leap in 2017 realistically. And, by the end of the year, it's going to be 2025. The end of the season, I mean. So, Middleton is probably the guy in the NBA that has not made an all NBA team that probably most deserved to at one point in his career, given how good he was for that stretch while Milwaukee was like truly contending at the top of the conference and was unbelievable. Probably won't do it now, but they need him to be a, top 30 guy, I would say, realistically, to win a title.
Yeah. I don't think he'll be that. He won't be that. I don't think you could argue that he'll be in that territory.
I don't think he will be in the regular season, but if he can be like a top 30 playoff guy, like he was last year, that's kind of what matters though. He won't be a top, that's not going to happen in the regular season. Still manages minutes and everything, but yeah. Okay. Fred, you got to get out of here. Please tell the people where they can find your work. Tell the people what you've got going on. Tell them about Cats and Shoot, baby.
You can read my stuff on The Athletic, all NBA coverage. Previously covered the Knicks, moved into a new job like a month ago, and doing the whole league now. You can follow me on Twitter at Fred Katz. You can subscribe to my podcast, Cats and Shoot, Katz and Shoot. And you could just go to patreon.com/Cats and Shoot. You can subscribe there. It's a Knicks podcast, but I do a lot of talk about the NBA and everything else. So if you enjoyed this, recording another podcast, the next episode tomorrow morning. And I should say on Friday morning, Cats and Shoot has equally fantastic production value as the Game Theory podcast does.
That is true. Shout out GMAC. Andrew Claudio is the best. Andrew would yell at me if I did not at any point put up the Game Theory social card. Go follow the Game Theory podcast over on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, at Game Theory Sam V, GameTheorySamV. Go follow all of those things. Go hit the subscribe button over on YouTube. You'll get to see Fred and I talk about all of this stuff. And go hit the subscribe button on all of your podcasting platforms that you use. Go to The Athletic. Keep me employed over there. I have a real mock draft up. You will get a ton of intel on where teams are, on players entering the season, where NBA scouts feel like have been excited about players, everything like that. So go subscribe to The Athletic, and you will get all of that content from the NBA mock draft. We will be back on Sunday with Bryce. Until next time, we'll talk soon.